looking at race, ethnicity, as well as some economic indicators as well. So this is an example at just like high level, just looking at basically counts. So for the next slide, going a little bit more in depth into some of the things the data provide. So in addition to just having the count, there's fields for tenant representation, for example. So this was a study we did looking at how the rollout of universal access to council, which is done by zip code, comparing some factors within the zip codes that have the program currently and that don't. So the graph on the left there was looking at tenant representation rate and seeing how that was impacted by the program, as well as the graph on the right was looking at executed evictions. And so the richness of this data, beyond just having a count at the zip code level, allows you to look at various things that happen throughout the case. So one of the things you're able to do is see the number of parties that are involved, whether they're represented. In non-payment cases, it talks about the amount that the landlord's claiming, and you're also able to track the case kind of throughout the process. So there's lots that goes on in between a filing, and if it ends up being an executed warrant of eviction, there's a lot of stages, and all of those are represented. So there's a lot you can do with this to look at more in depth of what's going on. So for the final slide that we have here, so obviously COVID has really significantly changed the landscape for eviction, housing instability. So we've been following the various moratoria that have been in place and looking at what's going on in housing court at different stages. And so again, this data is updated frequently enough that we were able to do like a weekly look at what was going on in housing court each week and track that to various policies, whether it was through OCA or through the governor, state legislature, federal government, et cetera. Look at what was going on in housing court, how that compared to previous years, and again, mapping out where eviction filings were taking place compared to what they looked like in a regular year. So there's a ton of opportunities to use this data to answer a lot of questions that it's something as simple as just looking at the counts and where the distribution is, but also being able to go into a lot more detail to find out what's going on in housing court. So it's really been an invaluable data set for a lot of different research projects.
All right. Nick, I work for the New York City Council data team. I'll be talking about what is the New York City Council, how the data team is involved, and why the OCA data is important to the New York City Council. So what is the New York City Council? The New York City Council is the lawmaking body of New York City. There are 51 elected members to the council from the 51 council districts in New York City. And obviously the laws of the city impact New Yorkers and how that relates to evictions and housing. And on the right, you can see a simplified version of how a bill becomes a law. So it starts with the council member idea, and then it goes to a legislative request, and then a bill is drafted, and a lot of times that's where the data team comes in, and then the bill is introduced. There's a public hearing, and again there the data team helps out. Then there's voting, a mayoral decision, and then a bill becomes a law. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see how is the data team involved in this process. So we provide understanding to issues with data for the council as well as the public on our webpage. And one part of the process where the data team is useful is that bill drafting phase that I talked about on the last slide. So really, if there are any numbers in the bill, then the data team is involved. So one instance is if there's a threshold or a quota number, the data team is involved in coming up with that number and making sure it makes sense. The data team is also involved if there's a reporting bill that requires agencies to publish certain data publicly. So we make sure that agencies are required to provide the information that is most relevant. And in addition, we advocate for data to be publicly available to increase transparency. And an example of that is the Marshall's eviction data that is now on open data. So why is the OCA data important for the council? The council passed Local Law 136 of 2017, which was the universal access law, or the right to counsel that we've been talking about. And originally it was to be phased in over 5 years, but that timeline has been accelerated with Intro 2050, the amendment, which says that there will be full implementation immediately. So the data is then important for evaluating that legislation. So the data being the Marshall's eviction data and the OCA data. So showing the success of the legislation is key to sustaining or growing funding commitments and determining if the legislation has saved the city money by keeping people in their homes instead of in shelters. So a recent use that the data team used the OCA data for was in January 2021. There was an oversight hearing on New York City Department of Social Services preparation for the expiration of the eviction moratoriums. So even with right to counsel, low-income residents can find themselves vulnerable and may find themselves homeless and entering the shelter system. So for the hearing and for the preparation of the hearing, the data team provided analysis and maps related to economic data, so unemployment numbers, the number of rent-burdened households, historical evictions data, DHS shelter population and demographic data, and as well we used the OCA data to get the number of eviction filings since COVID. And that's the same type of information that we're going to be using to create the data visualization in the second half of the program. So I'll hand it off to Rachel.
All right, great. Thanks so much, everyone. I know we've had a little bit of discussion going on in the chat, which has been great.
People have been asking for what reasons people are evicted, how to prevent evictions, more information about right to counsel.
Maybe if we want to just go over, I know you and Lucy have been talking a little bit about evictions and how to prevent people from being evicted. So if you just want to summarize for those who haven't been watching the chat, maybe Lucy.
One of the questions was, what is the cause of evictions? I think it's like thorny and complicated and very linked to what rights tenants do and don't have. And about half of our private housing stock is rent stabilized, and in rent stabilized housing, tenants have a right to renew their lease, but they might be paying a very low rent in the landlord's opinion. So that gives the landlord a lot of incentive to get them out of their apartment. And that dynamic changed a bit after the summer of 2019. There was the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act that passed at the state level. And so that solidified a lot of the rights that rent stabilized tenants have and decreased the incentive for landlords to target those particular tenants and use housing court as a way to get them out of their units. But that being said, housing court has traditionally been, there are people who call it an eviction mill. So just a way for landlords to get tenants out regardless of whether they have paid their rent or not. I hear a lot of stories on the Met Council hotline. So I volunteer on the Met Council on Housing. They run a tenant rights hotline. It's completely run by volunteers, but people can call in when they're having issues. So you'll get calls from people who are paying their landlord's rent and their landlords expect to get paid in cash. And when the tenant asks for a receipt, the landlord gets really resistant. Or they try to pay their rent by check and the landlord stops cashing the checks. And you might think, like, why would a landlord not cash their rent checks? And the reason is because they can then take the tenant to court for eviction and claim that the tenant hasn't been paying their rent when the tenant has been attempting to pay their rent, and it's the landlord who's using it as an excuse to not take it. So I work for a nonprofit that works for the tenant movement, and so I come at this from that perspective. Sure, there are some tenants who can pay their rent and don't pay their rent, but I roll my eyes at that. That's not the majority of cases. The majority of cases are either tenants can't pay their rent because they don't have work and don't have enough resources to pay their rent, or their landlord is intentionally trying to get them out because they want to be making more money.
There was a question earlier about what would the level 2 data show us that maybe either Maxwell or Lucy can take. And I think in addition to that, there's a new question, would available level 2 data be updated on a regular basis?
Yeah, sure.
I guess once it becomes available.
Data that we have now, we get on a weekly basis, and our idea for the level 2 data is that it will be the same thing. So we'll be updating that weekly. The level 2 data, there's kind of two parts to it. So we'll be getting the data, the folks that are kind of doing this advocacy work and going to be on the kind of agreement with OCA. We'll have the data with the full addresses so that we're able to kind of geocode it and link it to buildings. And so what having that address kind of unlocks is the ability to find individual buildings, as well as to kind of link across all the many other open data sets that exist at the building level. So things like housing code violations, Department of Buildings violations, history and information about the landlord and the property itself. And as Lucy mentioned, of some of the work that folks at JustFixNYC have done to kind of link buildings across ownership portfolios. That is kind of one part of it, and we'll both be able to do some of that analysis ourselves on the address level data, but we'll also be able to use the address and geocoding to building ID to like de-identify it at the building level and make a version of that data public in kind of a similar fashion as we have with the zip code level data. There are kind of some restrictions around building size for privacy concerns, and that's something we're kind of working out with OCA as part of this process, but some version of it will be made available publicly and updated on a weekly basis.
So, but we'll be taking the addresses, converting it to BBLs, which is the property identifier, and then we will only be able to make that data public for buildings that have 11 or more units, and we'll have to obscure the BBLs for cases in smaller buildings. And that's what OCA agreed to protect tenant privacy. And for those cases, we'll have to make the BBL null, and we can keep those cases in at a census tract level. So it'll be public, but we're not allowed to do anything at like a building level in buildings for 10 or fewer units.
There was
I'm so sorry,
question-
Maxwell, if you just straight up said that and I repeated it.
There was a question in the chat about whether the data set includes illegal lockout, harassment, and repair filings made by tenants. I think probably, again, either Lucy or Maxwell could talk a little bit about the kinds of cases that are in the data set and how you would tell what kind of case was being referred to based on the row in the data set, what variables you would look at.
All of those different types of cases are included. Non-payment are the vast majority of cases, but there are lots of other types of cases there. All of them are included, everything that goes through housing court. And we have some more information about specifics on those types of cases. I'm just kind of pulling up the data dictionary now. Actually, I can switch over my
Maxwell, I had actually pulled this to look at it for myself. I have the classifications and the counts for everything in OCA index. I can put that in the chat.
Oh, that would be great.
But you might as well pull it up in the data dictionary also. So yeah, you can see the types of cases and their frequency. So you have holdovers are evictions for breaching a lease or when a tenant doesn't vacate the apartment after their lease ends. Non-payment is eviction for not paying rent. Illegal lockout is when a landlord has illegally evicted a tenant from the unit. Like if the landlord changes the locks on you, that's illegal. And so that would be an illegal lockout case. Illegal activity, I think, is like if the landlord is saying that the tenant did something illegal in the apartment. HP is housing part, that's tenants suing their landlords. So that includes some type of harassment. If it says HP with harassment, HP would typically be like they're suing their landlord to make repairs that the landlord hasn't been making. Article 7A is rare, and I'm not gonna, it has to do with like really bad building conditions and transferring the ownership or the management to a third party. As you can see, there are only 94 of those in the entire data set, which goes back to 2016. Harassment cases, so tenants suing their landlord for harassing them. And a breach of warrant of habitability is a tenant, potentially they're trying to not pay their rent and they're not paying their rent because the landlord is not providing like livable conditions. So it's worse than just no repairs. And maybe the tenant attorneys can correct anything I got wrong in there. Sorry, what were you gonna say, Maxwell?
Oh, no, I was just going to add on, and the way that you would find some of this information, you can get it from the data dictionary that I was kind of referencing before. So this is a like public Google sheet that we have with a list of all of the different tables, as well as for any one of these. So you can click into the first initial table that has all the basic details about the case, and there's a column called classification. And then if you want to see all the kind of possible values that can take, there's a tab that you can link out to here that lists out all of those that Lucy just showed in the chat with the counts. So this is kind of how you can find out more about this, as well as these notes where we've added some of our own information from working with the data, common issues that you might come up with. For example, like in the court, there are 2 other courts that you might not know of that are in Brooklyn and Manhattan that, easy to miss, little kind of tricks like that.
I'm sorry, there's one quick question. Is the data just for housing court in the city or is it statewide?
So it covers all cities in New York State, so not smaller towns and villages. So it's just every jurisdiction that uses this universal case management system that the state OCA office runs. And so that covers many, almost probably most cases, but there are some smaller jurisdictions that are not covered in there. For a full list of which jurisdictions are and aren't in the data set, I can send you a link for that. It's in the documentation page.
So what we've put up in the chat is the how to log into SQLPad. What we've done is SQLPad basically allows you to access the OCA housing database using their interface. So we can show you some examples and how to start accessing the data and framing questions and starting to figure out how to answer them using SQL queries, which is the language that we use to interact with the data set. We're going to walk you through a bunch of these examples, but because you can log on, you can also follow along and run these queries yourself. The only thing that we ask is that you can see next to run, there's a little floppy disk button to save. We ask that you don't hit save on your queries, because if you do and you've changed things, you'll overwrite our version, and so that'll show up on our screen. which we don't want for right now. And I'll also add that I think we are able to keep this open for a week following the event. So if you want to come back and do some work afterwards, that'll also be an option. So we'll have everything going on the Zoom and we'll walk you through queries, but you can also follow along yourself on SQLPad. All right, take it away.
Great, thank you. This is SQLPad. This is kind of the environment that we're going to be connecting with the data and doing some analysis. So first, I just want to make sure everybody has gotten on successfully. There's an issue where sometimes if, depending on the browser and things, if you open it up, it might try to warn you and tell you not to go to the site. If you're on Chrome, there's a button where you can hit advanced and then proceed anyway to the link, and it should bring you to here. So feel free to just message in the chat if you're having some issues, and we can kind of help walk you through that. But just a kind of quick overview of what you're looking at, what this is. Don't get kind of overwhelmed by it if you're not familiar with kind of coding and that kind of data work. It'll be kind of like ready for beginners. The basic idea here, and I won't go too much into detail, is we have a database that includes all of this housing court data. It's running on a tool called SQL, and it has a database in it. We are kind of accessing it through this interface on the web. We can kind of write some code instructions to send to the database, and it then kind of retrieves what we ask for, and it sends it back to us in a kind of normal spreadsheet type data format that you might be familiar with. And so what we'll be going through today is how to kind of write these instructions to kind of specify what extract of the data you're looking for. So how this is actually all up there in the database is put together by the Housing Data Coalition. It's a project called NYCDB. So if you're interested in kind of learning more about this and all of the many other data sets, you can see kind of some of them on the side pane here that are also included. So things like housing code violations and vacate orders and the marshal's evictions, which we had talked about, as well as many other things. Those are all available here, and you can check out the presentation that we gave at last year's event to hear a little bit more about that. And so there's also a cheat sheet that we linked here, a PDF that kind of gives a breakdown of some of the kind of key terms and examples. But with that, I'll just dive right into some of the code. First step here is these are called queries, SQL queries. SQL is the coding language, and this is kind of what we're querying from the database asking for. So they have a set options that have to follow in the same order every time. These keywords are highlighted in blue, and then kind of other details in the black text here. So what we're asking for here is we want to select star, which means all of the columns from the table that we're calling OCA index. So this is the main table where each row is a case. And so you can see that this is a scrambled case ID. So they won't actually give us the one that you can look up the case file with. And then it has information about the court, when it was filed, the type of property it is, the type of case. So as we were talking about, many of them will be non-payment, but we also have HP, which might be for repairs and things, any kind of special information about them, and so on, kind of all of these different columns that are available. And so if you just kind of select all of this and hit run, it will send that instructions and bring back the data. One thing to note is that as we're working with this, it will only give you back 1,000 rows. And that's just to kind of prevent you from accidentally trying to request like millions and millions of rows and crashing things. So if you've reached that limit, it'll tell you here incomplete. And so that's just something to be aware of. There's a way to get this whole database set up for yourself, but this is a portal to it and a version of it that we have running as part of the Housing Data Coalition that we make available to our members. And we'll be able to use it here for today. But in future, if you want to either become a HDC member or kind of figure out your own way to do it, that's something we can definitely talk about more after. So that star is to get you all the columns, but you can also just list them out individually if you just want some subset. If we run this query, we'll get the same thing, but only these columns that we asked for and in the order that we asked for them. So that's the basics here, and then we'll move on to query 3.
Yeah, so building on what Maxwell said, we're going to learn about a new command, order by. We're going to again select the same columns that we're interested in, which are index number, file date, court, property type, status, and dispose date from the data table that we're interested in, which is OCA index. And then we're going to order by the file date. So what that's going to do, and with that descending command at the end, it's going to give you all of the filings with the most recent ones on top and then going down. So again, we're going to select the columns that we're interested in from the data table that we're using, and we're going to order by whatever variable we want. Here, we're going to order by the file date, and we're going to do it in a descending manner. That's that DESC, and then you'll see the most recent are at top. and then it goes down. And again, it's limited to those 1,000 rows that you can see there. And then if we go to the next one, we're going to learn a new command, where, which allows us to select only data meeting a specific criteria or multiple criteria that we're interested in. So in this case, again, we're going to start with selecting the columns that we're interested in from the data table that we're using, and then we're going to put where one of the columns meets some specific criteria. So in this case, we're going to say where the property type is equal to residential. So the other option is commercial, but here we're saying, okay, we're only interested in the residential cases. And just also as a note, the text in green, those are commented out, meaning that's not running right now. But then when we take out the comments, it will enter into the query. So we deleted those two dashes, and now we're going to add another criteria to our where statement. So in addition to just being residential, we're going to say, and we want the file date to be less than 2020 March 20th, and that's the beginning of the eviction moratorium. So now on the bottom there, you'll see only filings with the date previous to March 20th, 2020. So residential ones and only ones before March 20th, 2020. And now if we go to the third line, we're going to add in another one. We're going to say, in addition to just being residential and being before March 20th, 2020, we're only going to include this subset of courts. And these are the ones in New York City. And you'll see on the bottom there, as Maxwell is highlighting, we only have the ones that we've put in that string where it says court in, and then you list off the ones that you are interested in. And again, at the bottom there, after we pull all that, we ordered by the file date so that it goes in a descending manner, most recent ones on top.
I'm taking over at query 5. I think one of the things for me that is so awesome about SQL is that it kind of is intuitive when you read a query aloud, exactly what it's going to do. Not always, but when you read the words of a query, intuitively, you kind of understand what it's going to do, which makes it a lot more accessible sometimes than other languages. So hopefully, as we've been walking you through, you've sort of seen how to build on these particular words to start getting at answers to questions. But if you read out a query, often you can see kind of what it's going to do. In all the previous queries that we've shown, we've been looking at examples where you're returning individual row results. So we said we want to look at all of the filings within this OCA index, or the first 1,000 that come up, and that'll give you 1,000 rows. And then we were saying, okay, we only want to look at filings from this OCA index table that were filed before the eviction moratorium. So after that, everything's a bit of a mess. And so we'll return 1,000 rows, the first 1,000 rows of filings that have occurred before the eviction moratorium set in. But in each case, you're getting a sample of, or if you were running on a sort of a more sophisticated machine that didn't cut you off at 1,000, you would be getting a full set of all the rows that meet this criteria. The next step you might want to do is not just answer what are all the rows in my database that fit this criteria, but I want to perform some statistics on this. And so in the case of this first query we've set, we want to count up the total number of rows in our data set. So that's the command that's starting here. So I've said select count. So instead of telling you I want a particular row, like index number ID, or I want all the rows by using star, I'm saying what I want is this special thing, which is to count all of the rows using this term count. And then the second part of that line, which says as num evictions, is just saying that count isn't a very descriptive variable. So what I would like to do is rename the variable count as num evictions to help remind me when I go back and look at this query I ran, what was I counting again? I was counting the number of evictions. And so that's what I'm getting. And so the next lines are the same. So you can see we're still looking at the OCA index table. And then we're starting to set conditions on what we want to count. First modification to the query is to say, now we only want to count filings that have happened in our database, which I think starts in 2016. So it's not every filing ever, but filings since 2016 that both happened before the eviction moratorium, which is March 20th, 2020, and that are considered, that have an active status, so that in this case are still open. And you can see sort of with each restriction that we're adding, the total number of evictions is decreasing. That's because we're putting sort of more restrictions on what we want to count. So as you're saying, we want to count a smaller and smaller subset of the data, we are ending up with a smaller number. And so the final restriction we are putting is now we're saying, all right, we don't just want to count the number of cases that have been filed pre-COVID that are active, we only want to care about cases that are in New York City courts. And so these, again, are the 6 courts that are in New York City, with those tricky last 2 that I forget sometimes. And so we've now put sort of 3 different restrictions on our count using where, and that's decreased the total number of evictions. So the next thing we're going to introduce is, so we have looked at how to count up or do statistics, and the easiest one of which is just counting the number of rows that meet your criteria. For example, in the previous query, we had asked how many cases are active in New York City courts. But what if we wanted to know how many cases are active in each court? So you could run 7 different queries, each of which were saying where court equals and then the name of the court. You could run 7 different queries, 1 for each court, and then record the number or put somewhere the answer for the number of evictions filed in each court. And that would be perfectly valid, but it's annoying. It's manageable when there are only 7 courts you want to count up by. But what if you wanted to know something where there are 100 or 1,000 different possibilities? Then it becomes a lot less reasonable to say, I'm going to run a separate query for each of those cases. And that's where our newest SQL command comes in, which is group by. What I'm going to do in this first query is say, I'm selecting the count. So I want to count up the number of rows in my data set that reach this criteria. And I'm also selecting court because we're going to use what court case has been filed in to group by courts. So what I'm asking is, I want to know how many evictions have been filed total within our entire data set, but for each court. So if we run that, you'll see that there are 76 rows. So there's a row for each city court that has entries in our database, and then the number of evictions that have been filed in our database in each court is also listed. And so you'll notice every single row in the database is being counted. So though there are only 76 rows, the total number of evictions is much more than 1,000 because the restriction is only on reporting 1,000 rows, but we still have access to the full database. So once we start counting it up, we can display up to 1,000 rows. So here we're displaying 1 row for each court, and then we're displaying the number of evictions in our data set that have been filed in each court. So that's what group by allows us to do. In addition, we can add conditions onto these queries. So for example, if we only wanted to know residential filings, but we still wanted to know how many residential eviction filings had been filed in, or housing court cases filings had been filed in each court, we would add this restriction to say where property type equals residential. If we run that, we'll see that there are 7 rows. So there's a fun trick in this data set, which is that it happens, and that's only true because of this data set. It's not generally true that residential housing court filings are only included in this data set for New York City housing courts. So if you restrict to cases where the property type is residential, you automatically subset to only the courts in New York City, though you're only getting the residential filings for those courts because you've put sort of a further restriction on them. In our case, if we only care about residential filings within New York City, instead of having to add a condition that said, and where court is in and list all 7 of the courts, instead we can just say where property type equals residential, and we will automatically subset to residential court cases filed within New York City courts. So now we have just 7 rows, and each of these rows adds up the total number of evictions in our data set that are within each of these housing courts. So you can see how we're now starting to be able to really get useful information out of this database, where we're manipulating and transforming the rows of the database to give us information about what's happening throughout the city. And so what we're moving towards is a final question that I think Maxwell or Ryan is going to introduce now, to be able to really start looking at the scope of evictions within New York using this SQL language.
And just to quickly clarify, I think outside of New York City, residential cases are included. They just aren't classified as commercial or residential. So that's why they're not being included. But if you remove this and just counted, many of those that we saw before are residential. They just aren't classified one way or the other, and that's just due to different kind of reporting standards in each of the different courts. that's kind of one of the many little things that you have to just kind of figure out from working with the data, and everybody can contribute to the data dictionary so that we can find all these sorts of weird cases.
Great. So moving along towards our visualization example, we're adding more and more complexity to what we want to actually extract. And so what we're doing here is the file date that we have is the actual date. So the date is month, day, and year. So we can extract different parts of that to group. So for the example here, where the select, again, we're taking a lot of the basic information that we want, like the index number, the court that it's coming, property type, all those type of things that are automatically included in the data, but we can also extract and create new columns. So what we're doing here is we're extracting the year from the file date to get as the file year. And so now we've created this new column based on information from the file date. And that will allow us to do things like grouping by year to get a count by the year, where that's not immediately available to do with just the file date listed as it is. Are we uncommenting these next ones as well? What we're doing here is, again, looking at month instead of year, different ways of doing that. So again, you can group by month, you can do a group by month and a year. That allows you to just continuously count in different ways. And so this is combining them together. So this is one of the ways that we kind of work around not necessarily needing the exact day that it's filed on, but getting it so that we can aggregate by month and year. Or in the post-COVID analysis that we were doing before, we did this where we wanted the week as well. So what this allows you to do, extracting this month year, is get a count of month and year. And so again, this is just combining a lot of the information that we've had before, where we're again getting this month year variable to group on, getting other information, getting accounts, and filtering out to just the residential, which again will take out the commercial cases in New York City, but also because New York City is the only one that categorizes it this way, this is getting just New York City filings as well. When we group by file month and year and do this, again, the count that we did before, that's going to give us the actual count by month year. And that's one of our last steps. I think, Lucy, were you doing this last query to get us to the CSV that we'll be using?
This is a query that does something very similar to the last one. We are selecting 5 columns, selecting or creating. I guess we're creating all of them. So the first one is this to-char, TO_CHAR. That function is turning whatever's inside of it into text. What's inside of it is the file date field, and then extracting the month. It's a predefined function in SQL, which is going to look at a variable that's stored as a data type, and it's going to be able to take the month out of that, but in Word form. It's kind of SQL just being smart and knowing what I want. So this function to-char, I Googled something like get the name of the month from a date SQL is how I found that. So that's what's going to give us the January, February, March. So it's taking any date that has 01 as the month of the date and outputting it as January. Next, extract month is doing the same thing, but that extract function that you saw in an earlier query, where it's going to take the month as a number. Then the same thing for the year. And the reason we want to have both names and numbers will eventually become apparent, hopefully soon. So we want the number to be able to order it properly, because if we order by the name of the month, it's going to do it alphabetically rather than in the order of the months themselves. And then we want to be able to combine the month with the year. So this is basically the steps I went through to get a pretty month and year output for our visualization. First one is the names of the months. Second one is the numbers of the months. Third one is the years of the month. And then this complicated concatenate function is doing a bunch of things. Concat or concatenate means to smush things together into a block of text or a string. I want to say I have a column and it says red, and I have another column that says apple, and I want a column that says red apple, I will concatenate those 2 columns together and it will give me red apple. Because there's nothing in our data that says January 2016, I have to create it. So I do that by getting the name of the month, getting the year, and then concatenating them together. So that's this concat. Then I'm doing the to care file date month. That's the same thing as I did before. So that's just doing the same thing as it's doing here. Comma that's how I'm separating the things I want to concatenate together. So I'm doing comma and then single quote, then a space and a single quote. And that's saying put a space in the thing that you're outputting, comma for the next thing. And then I'm doing the same extract year from file date that I did here. And that's giving me my filed month year. I then also did the count everything. So that's from the earlier group by. So that is now grouping everything into a neat month and year, and then giving me the number of filings for that month. Over the course of all the data we have, you can see it goes back to January of 2016. From OCA index, we've seen this where property type equals residential. I'm doing that to get all the residential filings in New York City. And then I have to group by everything. So I've got my filed month num, filed year, filed month year. And then the reason I had to keep this column was that so I could order it properly, because my data visualization will likely get messed up if I don't do that. So I ordered it by the filed year and then the filed month number. It's going to put my years in order. And then after it does the year, everything that has the same year, it's going to order by the month num. So did all of that just to get this January, February. These are the only two columns I care about for the actual visualization.
Lucy, do you want to just show what happens if you switch the ordered by?
Yeah,
Just so
switch it
people
to
can
what?
see. Just switch the order of the two.
Oh, sure.
Just to, I think, illustrate a little.
Also, there was something coming up in the chat about the commenting, which is important when you end up working with this. Sorry, wait, I'll go do one thing and then the other. So this goes 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. So this is useless for like showing things on a chart over time. I don't want to see all my Januaries and then all my Februaries. So I'm going to put it back to file year and then file month num. So there was questions about like I'm running my query, but nothing is changing when we were doing filters with the where clauses. And that's because we preset some of these to be commented out. So if we add these little hyphens in here, the text turns green and it's no longer applying. And so you do that so you can kind of like leave things out as you go and put them back in, or to say like, here's what this line is doing, and write comments to yourself. So I just wanted to add that quick note. This at the top, which does like the slash star slash, that does the same thing. I'm going to download the CSV. So it has downloaded. I'm going to open it up. I have Excel downloaded, so that's what it's going to open up in. You could open this up in whatever spreadsheet program you have, or you could put it into Google Sheets to do the same thing I'm about to do. I've got my CSV ready to go, comma separated values, and that's like kind of the simplest table structure of data to use for all kinds of things. And then I'm going to go to Datawrapper, which you all have a link in your chat for. I can just go to start creating, no sign up needed, which is nice. It's really quick to get started. So all I need to do is copy these two columns that I care about, the month year and the number of evictions. I just highlighted the two columns and then copied it, and I'm pasting it here. You can kind of see that it's pasting it. I can see that it's pasting in the way that I want it, and I hit proceed. There are more advanced versions, like ways to import your data, but doing something that simple will work for this. So the second screen is going to check the data types. Dates are in green. That's good. It's important for this to recognize these as dates. If it recognized it as a string or text, it wouldn't do what I want it to do. And then the number of evictions is in the number. So this looks good and I can proceed. I can also use that to change the data type. So on the next screen, it's going to take a guess at what visualization to make with my data. So this is pretty good. This is just a line graph showing from 2016 to 2021, and I can highlight over each month. It'll say it's the first of the month and it'll show me the value. I am personally not a huge fan of line graphs for volumes month by month because it suggests that it's continuous when really we're showing a total every month. I think we have a lot of smart data people, and I'd be curious what other people think about this, but that's my take on it. So I'm going to switch it to a column chart. If anyone wants to advocate for a line graph, I'm here to, I'll listen. I'm going to put a title. The title is going to be NYC eviction filings by month. And this is already like pretty close to the final thing. I did a little bit of tweaking this when I was playing around earlier. To me, like the x-axis on the bottom looks good. The y-axis looks good. So I made the size a little wider. I forget it was at 400 or 500, but because it's a lot of bars, I wanted to give it enough space. I had done some stuff with the colors to try to highlight COVID earlier, so I can show you some of the ways I played around with that. I'm gonna find this kind of like light red color to give everything by default. And then I'm gonna custom select some of the months that I want the viewers to focus on. So I'm gonna pick March. And you'll see this is March here. All right, that'll be on the next screen, I think. And date format, let's try this. No, that's not what I want. Well, I like how when I hover now, it says March 20th. I guess that's okay. Anyway, you can choose different formats that you like. Okay, so I'm gonna pick March. I'm gonna make this a little darker. That's fine, because I wanna say, okay, that's the first month of COVID. And you'll see it's not all the way down because the eviction moratorium, I think the court cases didn't stop coming in until March 23rd. And I'm also going to highlight April, May, and June with those darker colors. And, you know, this is just because I want to show this is like about when the eviction moratorium was really, like the first one was really in effect. There's obviously more I could do with that. There's lots of like adjustments I could make. This just changes the spacing between the lines, which I think looks nice-ish. Anything else? Custom range? No, this is good. The axis is going from 0 to 20,000. I really like the hover feature that just automatically happens. And then I can do some customizing of it. Oh, I thought it was there. Where's the, let's see. Oh, show values on hover. Right. Okay. If I do always, it's all going to overlap and that looks really messy and bad. On the next screen, I can also add a text notation, which is kind of cool for this because I want to talk about what happened during a particular time. So I'm going to add in March 2020 just to point out what that one column is. And there's a line I can click for draw line to annotation text. Put my little marker where I want it, move the text. So now I like this way of just saying, okay. So even if somebody's not hovering over, if they're on their phone or something, they can see exactly what that is. And I could add additional language saying like, can you click it right? Let's see. Let's add some text. Okay, so I'm gonna leave it there to not overcomplicate things. So I could also highlight a range. That's nice. So I could do that too. And then I'm gonna proceed. I'm gonna enable social media share. Share, I don't know, whatever. Share chart URL. None of that really matters right now. And then I hit publish chart and now it's public and I can share it wherever I want with this link. There's also embed code to like embed it on a website, but I can just send this link around. I'll put it in the chat and you'll see when you click on it, it will give you this visualization. Okay, that's it for the visualization.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lucy. I wonder actually if we could, Maxwell, if you wanted to pull up and talk a little bit about our final two queries, which introduced join. So I know there was a question about join earlier in the chat during the SQL session. So everything we've shown so far involves just the OCA index data table. But as Maxwell's mentioned, there are 11 different data tables in our data set that are all linked together. And so if you need information from two different tables, what do you do?
Yeah, so this introduces another one of the SQL keywords here, join. And then there are a variety of slight variations on join, but essentially what this does is it takes two tables or spreadsheets in Excel, you can imagine, and it uses a column that exists in both tables. So it has to be like a common column that they have, and then it uses the values in that to find which rows to match together. So if folks are familiar with Excel, this is similar to like a VLOOKUP. The kind of join exists in other kind of data analysis tools. Here we're going to work with the index table and we're going to join it to the addresses table, which just have the zip codes. And so we'll take from the addresses table, we'll look for the index number ID, and then from the index table, we'll look at the index number ID, and wherever those two are the same, it joins those two rows together. And so again, we can use star to select all of the columns. In this case, we'll be getting, you can just do star, but you can also do the table.star, which will give us all of the columns from OCA index, and then you could then get all of the columns from the addresses. And that's what we're going to end up with here when we run this query. And so we've also got some of the same things from last time. We're ordering it by index number, and then we're keeping only the ones that are residential. So that's residential and only New York City. Sometimes you run into an issue where if a column appears in both tables with the same name, you can use the kind of table prefix of table name dot column name to kind of make sure it knows which one you're talking about. If you leave it ambiguous and it doesn't know, it might kind of give you a message telling you that. But now you can see this looks like what we had before, except all the way at the far right side, you see it has some other information that we didn't have access to before. So the city the state, and the zip code. And so that unlocks a bunch of other cool analysis that you could do with this data set. As we were talking about before, this allows you to do some kind of basic, geographic data, or like Ryan was talking about, looking at like universal access to counsel. There's like all sorts of kind of relevant uses for the postal code or the zip code. And this is kind of how you bring that in. If folks have more questions about like exactly how joins work and like some of the other complications, that's also something we can talk a little bit more about in the breakout rooms afterwards. I can just say the left option here just means that you will get all of the rows from the first table you mentioned, the left table. So we'll get every row from the indexes, and then we'll also join in information where available from the right table, in this case, addresses. There are other ways so that you only get the rows back that match in both tables, and other kind of variations, but left is going to be what you want for like almost all cases. Yeah, so here's just an example where we do a lot of the same thing. So we've starting with the OCA table. We're joining to the addresses based on the index number ID. A kind of helpful shortcut when they are named the same thing in both tables, you can do using and then the index name, and that just makes it a little bit easier to read. But then once we've joined on that information, we now have access to that. So the postal code we have here, we can take just the first 5 digits of it from the left and call that the zip code. And then we can use that zip code column that we just created up here in our group by. So we're going to group by those 5-digit zip codes, and then we're going to count to get like the number of cases. And then that's what we'll get back here, 1 row for each zip code. So this is just kind of like the quick introduction to how these joins work. These can, as you can imagine, get really complicated really quickly if you're joining lots of tables. So you can actually have multiple joins. So after this, we could then join to another table. So something like appearances, and kind of bring in even more information. And then that's where things start to get a little bit complicated, because you have an issue where 1 row in the index table corresponds to 1 case. But in the appearances table, 1 index can have multiple appearances. And so when you join those together, you will have as many rows for each case as there were appearances. And so if you're not careful how you're kind of doing your aggregations, you could accidentally kind of double count a case for every time that there was an appearance or something like that. So you have to really be kind of careful and think through in advance what you're doing before you do it. Add a lot of counts and things along the way to kind of check what you're doing and make sure you're not doubling your number of rows and that sort of thing. But once you kind of have mastered, or at least have just like a basic idea of how to do these joins, it really unlocks the full data set. Because as we were saying, there's like 11 different tables. And so, for example, there were some questions about how can you figure out how many filings actually end in an eviction, or how many filings have representation for one of the parties. So all of this, you would need to join on more detail to the OCA index table, for example, joining in the parties and to see if they're represented, or joining in the warrants to see if there were warrants issued, and if they were they executed. All these sorts of things require these joins. And so that's definitely something to kind of learn a little bit more about if you're interested, but this is just a kind of quick preview.